All right, with that, I'll introduce our next moderator, Tim Kazansky from the Defense Standardization Program Office. Tim runs our qualification program and the non-government standards program lead within the office. The years ahead need to be a period of intensified application of tools and processes that allow us to transform documents from not just paper-based documents, but to digital data, digital products that'll help us to make better and faster decisions. Additionally, it'll be time for both government and industry to reevaluate the form in which standards and standardization data will take. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. The DoD has a growing interest in the concept of smart standards and documents as digital data, and there has been an emergence of other ways in which standards are packaged, such as architectures. Marketplace tools and technology that allow documents to be machine and human readable will allow the department to make the leap from paper-based documents to digital data, models, and architectures. Only by working with partners in industry, in standards development organizations, non-government standards bodies, and other like-minded individuals can we truly transform the way we package standards. We are joined by 3 speakers who are well-versed on this topic and look forward to an interesting session, which discusses what changes are currently underway and coming for the future. On stage with me this morning are Mr. George Gulla from the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, and Mr. Jonathan Archer from SAE International, and joining us virtually is Ms. Lesley West from ASTM International. Our first speaker this morning is going to be Mr. George Gulla from ANSI. George is the Senior Vice President of Publication Sales, Business, and Membership at ANSI. Mr. Gulla is responsible for establishing and implementing ANSI strategic and operational goals for publication sales and membership growth and revenue diversification. Mr. Gulla is also responsible for the development of relationships that will align the Institute with applicable national, regional, and worldwide commercial sales and marketing initiatives, and is an active member of various ISO and IEC advisory and working groups. Prior to joining ANSI, Mr. Gulla spent 25 years in the financial services industry, serving banking institutions, corporations, government, academia, and consumers, and held various management positions in research, product management and development, marketing, sales, licensing, and intellectual property rights management. Here to talk today about ISO and the IEC Smart Standards Program, please welcome Mr. George Gulla. George.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel session today. In doing so, I will be providing some background and a general update on the ISO and IEC Smart Standards Program. Next slide, please. For many years, standardization bodies in various countries, including ISO, IEC, and CENELEC, have been entertaining the topic of digital data, now referred to as machine-readable standards or smart standards. For the ISO and IEC community, SMART stands for Standards, Machine Applicable, Readable, and Transferable. Next slide. We have all experienced the evolution of document formats from hard copy to PDF to XML, and now ISO and IEC have an initial focus on machine-readable content with an eventual focus on machine-interpretable content. Generally speaking, SMART is an innovative new class of standards that would be consumed by machine without human intervention. A new type of ISO and IEC product providing standards as structured data and information, enabling machines to query, extract, assess, decide, and execute based on the standard's content. Next slide. With the Industrial 4.0 revolution well underway, many industries have evolved from mechanical to mass production to automation to digital. Industries that have adopted digital technologies are more capable of handling standards information in far more efficient ways, tailored to industry needs. Smart standards would address the gap between the technological advances within industries and how standards are delivered and utilized today. Next slide. In 2019, an ISO Strategic Advisory Group on Machine-Readable Standards conducted a survey of technical committees about their use of and industry demand for machine-readable standards. Subsequent to the survey, open sessions were conducted where representatives of technical committees had the opportunity to share their experiences and their industry needs. Listed here are the committees that had submitted proposals or had expressed potential or immediate need for SMART standards. Next slide. In 2021, ISO established several SMART working groups. The SMART Steering Group would provide overall direction of the SMART program and advise ISO on major decisions and changes related to the program. The Use Cases Group would develop a comprehensive understanding of user needs and assess different solutions. The Business Model Group would identify different business models and any legal implications. The Technical Solutions Group would identify, design, test, and implement the tools and infrastructures for authoring, processing, publishing, and distributing SMART standards. ANSI is an active member on all four groups. Next slide. Concurrently, the IEC SMART standards concept was developed by SMB Strategic Group 12, also known as SG12, to advance the digitalization of IEC standards, its processes, and its deliverables. The concept aimed at applying existing service and architecture methodologies to standardization and conformity assessment with the ultimate goal of making the IEC a truly digital organization. SG12 was already capitalizing on 2 years of analysis and development of an information model and delivery model, relying on user stories and use cases originated from Sensenelec. Next slide. In 2021, the IEC established a task force on SMART standardization and conformity assessment to coordinate the work on SMART across the entire organization, taking into account the ongoing work within SG12 and future work in the Conformity Assessment Board. The task force was also responsible for looking at business model aspects, commercial policy and use cases, liaison with national committees and with the ISO SMART Steering Group wherever needed. Again, ANSI is an active member on the IEC task force. Next slide, please. In late 2021, it became evident for ISO and IEC to lay out a foundation for a common vision and coordinated development effort focused on seeking opportunities for alignment, synergies, and defining the rules of engagement between the two organizations. Both organizations recognize the need for a credible, open SMART platform model, serving the needs of the broadest spectrum of stakeholders, members, experts, and end users. In November 2021, the leadership of both ISO and IEC met to discuss the status of their respective SMART activities. Although different in structure, the two programs had many commonalities. The view of a common approach and joint activities was supported by a list of elements of alignment and consensus. Subsequently, an IEC-ISO SMART collaboration framework was drafted, while program governance established a joint coordinating group with the aim of facilitating ISO and IEC alignment. The ISO steering group and the IEC task force would maintain their current independent governance strings and report to their respective boards. The joint coordination group would develop common recommendations and guidance for consideration and endorsement by both entities. Next slide, please. The Joint Coordination Group held its first meeting to establish a common understanding of where ISO and IEC stand in terms of the program and projects, identify priorities and key milestones, identify where coordination is needed, and where potential issues are. The Joint Coordination Group put forth several recommendations. To ensure user stories collected by SG12 are used for the analysis within the newly formed Joint Use Cases Group, to ensure ISO and IEC technical committees willing to test the information model developed by SG12 were identified, and coordinate the piloting activities to avoid duplication of effort. To engage with regional standard organizations to define a common strategy to help elicit and consolidate requirements from their end users, with Sensenelec engagement already established to begin exchanges with ITU, and to engage with key stakeholders and end users through ISO members and IEC national committees. Next slide. For the use cases workstream, a joint ISO-IEC project team was established, leveraging the existing ISO use cases project and the IEC use case methodology. For the business model work stream, a joint ISO-IEC project team was established, leveraging the existing ISO business model project and commercial policy representatives from IEC national committees. In terms of technical development, it was decided to maintain the two existing groups separate, ISO Technical Solutions and IEC SG12, but within a coordinated mechanism to ensure consistency through cross-representation. Next slide. In March 2022, the Joint Use Case Group started collecting use cases from ISO technical committees that had been identified in the 2019 survey. These early adopters in the ISO Technical Committee submitted 12 ideas with several more to follow. The group's work is framed by the IEC 62559 Use Cases Standard, which provides a consistent analytical framework for use case collection and analysis. Establishment of a joint repository of use cases with IEC included access to SG12 developed use cases. Develop a joint ISO-IEC approach to JTC1 to initiate the collection of use cases from JTC1 structures, and an agreement in principle to use the JIRA database managed by Sensenelec to collect user stories with a clear identification of ISO, IEC, and Sensenelec submissions. Next slide. The Joint Business Model Group is in the process of drafting and modifying a survey of revenue models that would go out to ISO members and IEC national committees. It's important to understand how revenue models will be impacted as a result of ISO and IEC SMART standards. An initial draft of possible commercial scenarios was proposed to the joint project team. Pricing, licensing, copyright protection, and legal aspects are, of course, all under consideration. And the group also convened its first ad hoc meeting with ISO Technical Solutions. Next slide, please. In terms of collaboration among IEC SG12 and ISO Technical Solutions, a collaboration moving forward document had been drafted describing the proposed coordination mechanism between ISO and IEC technical teams. It will be revised and updated as collaboration progresses. ISO Technical Solutions delegated an expert to SG12 to deep dive on the ongoing work of version 1 of the IEC standard information model. And certainly more learning will be accomplished through a joint IEC ISO workshop format. Discussions on common terminology in an IEC ISO joint workshop format is progressing nicely. ISO Technical Solutions is sharing with SG12 learning related to information modeling and analysis. Phase 1 of the project is focused on a common vision, understanding of SMART and related concepts through terminology discussions, reviewing the existing work on information modeling, and the approach to design a common version of SMART architecture. During Q3, Phase 1 will include the start of a gap analysis and market review, technology, tools, format, etc., expertise and models. Phase 2, implementation of pilots, will start with analysis of use cases, assisting the joint business model group with scenarios that will include necessary preparations for piloting. Next slide, please. Looking now at the development of SMART terminology, ISO Technical Solutions has organized several ad hoc sessions with the purpose of reaching alignment on a common understanding of SMART levels, and any other basic SMART terminology through definitions with a view of preparing the foundations for a common SMART vision and architecture. A step-by-step approach will be to review and compare existing definitions of SMART and SMART levels from relevant sources, to select or create common definitions, for basic SMART terminology to identify the list of terms, map existing definitions, select and/or draft common definitions. Identifying the list of terms and mapping existing definitions are priority, since other projects and work streams within the overall program are requiring common understanding of SMART and SMART levels. Following a joint workshop held in late April, ISO Technical Solutions and SG12 produced an initial draft of common document incorporating the latest versions of the terms developed by the two groups. Next slide, please. As a side note, an additional work stream called Smart Sharing Experiences and Lessons Learned was launched, in which 7 sessions were convened with ISO members during May and June. This stream remains open for all ISO members who would like to present their developments and/or perspectives on SMART. The presentation format included SMART-related activities, approach and concept, which included goals and objectives, key ideas, use case identified, business values, tools and solutions used, main challenges, conclusions and lessons learned, and expectations and recommendations. These sessions provide ISO with valuable insight and perspective on members' plans for SMART and will be shared with the various groups and work streams. Next slide. Regarding conformity assessment, consideration of the IEC side, conformity assessment board colleagues are already involved at the IEC SMART level and with the IEC SMART task force. And in the CAB June meeting, it has been decided to create a group on digital transformation, which would also follow SMART. Consideration on the ISO side, Casco had been onboarded to the project, including CAB members, in May, with a successful workshop leading to the confirmation of the importance to consider conformity assessment at every step of the SMART implementation. A proposal to create a joint conformity assessment group was put forth. Progress updates will be provided on a regular basis by the SMART team, who will be in charge of proactively flagging everything that would require an ad hoc session or in-depth review of conformity assessment. Next slide. Here is the high-level timeline for the ISO IEC SMART program, which captures activities of ISO IEC governance and the various work streams, use cases, business model, technical solutions, as well as communications. One important element that I would like to emphasize is the tremendous amount of collaboration and coordination taking place between ISO and IEC, between the various groups and work streams, and with ISO and IEC members. Next slide. Here we have a dashboard summary of the deliverables during the first half of 2022, highlighting what has been completed, work in progress, and what is in the pipeline. Next slide. And finally, we have a summary of the planned deliverables for the second half of 2022. As of the end of July, most deliverables were in progress while others in the pipeline. In the months ahead, the joint use case group, along with ISO members and IEC national committees, will be reaching out to their customers to elicit input. The joint business model group will be moving forward on assessing future licensing rights and business models, along with data and copyright protection, and assess any legal implications. The ISO technical solutions at SG12 will be finalizing terminology work, drafting SMART architecture, the standards information model, along with several technical pilots. I believe everyone has access to these slides, so you can certainly review them in more detail at your leisure. Next slide. So that is the update on the ISO IEC SMART Standards Program. I hope this has been informative and useful. And again, thank you for having me here today for your time and attention.
Thank you, George. Our next speaker, Ms. Lesley West, is from ASTM International. Lesley is joining us virtually. There she is. Hello, Lesley. Lesley is the Director of Product Management for ASTM International's publications in the Sales and Marketing Division. In a role, Ms. West maintains and enhances existing product lines and user tools for ASTM standards and related products that support standards and consensus development like ASTM Spec Builder, as well as adding new features to the ASTM delivery platform, ASTM Compass, and launching new offerings such as the soon-to-be-released requirements management tool for Compass users. Ms. West works to integrate other development work at ASTM with other innovators such as ASTM Laboratory Services and the ASTM Business Development and Innovation Team working in emerging technologies and new market intelligence. Here to talk about what standards developing organizations like ASTM are doing in creating and delivering standards for the 21st century, standards that work, please welcome Ms. Lesley West. Lesley?
Just doing a quick audio test. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Funny thing happened to me on the way to make my first visit to my family in Ireland. I have an old Irish aunt I wanted to see for the first time in 3 years. And sure enough, I came home with a lovely case of COVID. So very sad to not be able to join you all in person today. And many, many thanks to the DSP and especially the LMI staff for inviting me today and and helping me appear virtually. So I do appreciate that. This particular topic is one that's very dear to me, and I don't have the answers because we're all still in conversation, but I certainly will be closely watching your panels later today and hear what all our friends from the mill committees and the Department of Defense organizations are doing, and really listening to how you want to work. And work, that's really the key to my message today. I've heard and considered many ideas on what SDOs should be doing to support industry in the 21st century. And ultimately, whatever solutions we come up with, whether it be the folks in ISO IEC and the Sensenelec teams, but also with organizations here in North America, our solutions have to work. So industry can work the way they want to work and the way they need to work. And it's really that simple, but it just has, it seems a little hard to get there. So that's what I want to talk about a bit today. Taking a pandemic pause was really a fallacy. For some of us, we were thinking, okay, we're not as readily able to have conversations with our industry constituents, or it's not quite as easy in the virtual format. So our observation, though, is the industry did the opposite. They took the opportunity over the pandemic to better digitize, to address the fact that more of their employees were virtual, their supply chain conversations were more virtual. And so there really has been an escalation, which both Joe and George alluded to in their conversations earlier. So what I thought I knew going in a few years ago is no longer completely relevant. As we heard from George, Sensenelec, ISO, IEC have continued and accelerated their exploration to put a lot more structure around the conversation from NSB to NSB and within ISO committees. Currently, with my friend George here and our wonderful colleagues at SAE, we're planning an updated get-together of SDOs to especially and most importantly organize more conversations with the writers and users of standards so we can be better aligned as well. More about that in a little bit. My ASTM users are SAE's users, and our users are users of ANSI content. So colloquially, we have the same constituents and customers wanting to do the same work. So being aligned is critical. So next slide, please. So here's the components of a standard, right? We at ASTM, as staff and publishers, we see and have traditionally seen standards as a whole. That's how we publish them. Our committees draft and approve them as a whole unit. They have their intent. It's wrapped around the full standard normative document. And then our users, well, they're going to see them in components. And that's certainly something that's quite clear. And we absolutely understand that. But as an ASTM staff person, I'm still bound to the intent of that committee has placed on that ASTM standard when they approved it. So as an SDO, I can and should be asking how industry needs these potential components identified. And maybe we need to ask our committees to support this more by identifying these components during drafting. Maybe we make this easier on the front end with the drafting tools we provide. We're smart publishers and we know how to ID content, but we just don't feel comfortable making the call ourselves. So that's one of the challenges we have. I was talking to an engineer a few months ago about component management tools, and we got to the topic of context. And I was saying, look, okay, how about if I just let you know if you've highlighted a bullet and that bullet changes when there's a new version, would that be helpful to you? And the response was, yeah, that's good. But what if there's another bullet that's added below and above that content? Are you going to tell me when something changes in the periphery? So it's this piece about components is tricky. And so more to come on that too. Next slide, please. So here's the thing, and this is really my message today, along with work, is how do we get there? And it's through partnerships. Again, George just talked to us a lot about some intense partnership work within ISO, IEC, within the different NSBs of the CENCENELAC, and we're looking to accelerate these conversations among the SDOs here in North America, and also with the engineering community, which is the critical thing. And this is where it starts. What are the problems industry has in building a more efficient 21st century way of working that SDOs and NSBs need to support? And what does that support solution look like? Is it one or two solutions? Or, as I have observed, especially over the pandemic era, lots of solutions, all clever in their own way. I've observed effort to go into solutions for several years and not seen all these solutions used. It could be, yeah, that's cool, but it sounds expensive, or yeah, that's cool, but we've already got our own way of working. What is the magic set of problem solutions that will start creating lasting effect for a large density of standards, authors, and users? We need continued partnerships between industry and SDOs to continue these conversations and consider the options. What does industry need from us, from standards developers, to build a 21st century standard structure? Everything? Nothing? In the standards world, it's time to reset this post-pandemic discussion and see where we stand. Next slide, please. There are many things to discuss. There are many things to understand. Here's just one small example that I thought I would set out. That's a challenge for most SDOs and frankly, folks in engineering that I speak with. How is a standard used in different roles within a business? We're pretty sure there are significant differences between how the, say, INCOSE accredited systems engineer takes and absorbs a standard into systems versus how a lab manager is going to manage the standard versus how the regulations manager is going to track the standard against regulatory work for the organization. Can solutions work for all of these roles and more? Do we need different solutions for the different needs within an organization? What does everybody need to work smarter? Next slide, please. So we continue the conversation, and of course, it's harder when we all can't be together at industry events, even when a wonderful organization like Michael and Tasha's DSP put a wonderful in-person event together when somebody gets COVID and on summer vacation and is quarantined and can't attend. So we are needing to continue to find more clever ways to talk and learn. Here's some of the direct comments that I just heard over the last year. Data is growing exponentially in industry. It's all about how we handle it. So it's scale, right? So as organizations have digitized fast over the last couple of years, data, as this one engineer quoted to me, it's growing exponentially. And if I throw all the data from our standards into the mix, it's even more burgeoning, and how those things relate to each other. So scale is critical thing to consider. We need to select specs based on the project. We pull in industry and company standards. Updates must be incorporated and managed in a way to minimize risk and be communicated. And often communication means across the supply chains, right? So it's the organizer, it's the buyer, it's the different OEMs, the tertiary, and so on. How is all this going to be communicated in an effective way so that the whole process and chain is efficient? Next slide, please. One engineer says for their particular organization, they'll freeze requirements at the beginning of a project, and that minimizes risk, but it doesn't mean they still don't need to know when the components that they've adopted from a standard have changed. And of course, this is always a challenging piece. Why did they change? So change management is still an important factor. The process, engineering process, needs impactful solutions. So we can come up with solutions all day. Like I said, we're clever publishers at SDOs, but what we come up with, is it going to be impactful? Is it going to be useful? Next slide, please. It's easy to read a standard, hard to apply a standard. So how can we make that standard more efficient so it's easier to apply? When we have a look back, we need to have a trail back to the data sources we deployed. I have a lot more to say on that particular topic, but for now, let's just slap clarity down as an issue. It's got to be, the data's got to be clear and researchable and understandable. We want to avoid turnbacks and increase speed to market. So we need efficiency. Is the information presented in a clear way that everybody can use it? And so there's reduction of mistakes, and we have to redo and increase time and cost in doing that. Next slide, please. So after listening, we took some of the information that we got, and we've been interpreting that into user stories. We have more complex user journeys. I just thought I'd share a few of these ideas, and maybe some of the folks in the room will think on how we're interpreting and let us know how we're doing as far as interpreting your needs. And again, this is just one small, tiny part of a very big picture that the standards industry is forming. When engineers need to incorporate part of a normative standard in their internal specifications, they need to agree on what part of the standard to incorporate. That seems simple. Sure, I've talked to organizations where one engineer says, nope, it's just me. I choose what part of the standard to incorporate, and that goes into the specification, and that's that. And I've also been with organizations as visitor and seen a clipboard still go around to 80 engineers who have to sign off on, yes, this is now going to be the standard that we apply for this particular type of project. So somewhere in there needs to be, and there's a possibility to deliver greater efficiency. Next slide, please. When engineers include normative standards information like requirements in their specifications and models, they need to add diffs to the way standards were written. Some call them overlays. I think Department of Defense usually referred to as a diff. These could include requirement overlays, and that has several purposes. Sometimes it's to clarify ambiguous language, and more on that in a second. And it could just be to alter measurement or frequency or process. So that's something that engineers need to do as well. Next slide. Some engineers add reference to normative standards and have them copied and pasted from a standard into their model-based system or into their PLM. Some are very, very fastidious and will put in a full reference, but I've also had engineers show me how they'll copy and paste, and the concern there is the information has gone out into the wild. When the standard changes, they have a hard time knowing that that data has been affected, whether directly or we just talked about context. From a longer issue in review, years in future, someone's stuck having a hard time seeing where that content was originally acquired from. And so that kind of data management may not scale. One government agency standards manager talked to me about this and pointed out that, in small snippets, it's probably manageable with notes and so on. But once you get into the kind of burgeoning of data that I just talked about, it's going to be a lot harder to track this way of proliferating standards information. Next slide, please. Talked about ambiguity. So this is something ASTM is taking a look at right now. That's not new. A lot of standards organizations, including many of the groups that George talked about, have done some studies of the ambiguity level of their content. We hear about the long-term goal of machine-to-machine readability. So how far does standard language need to progress? One of our VPs at ASTM confirms that they're working with engineers in emerging technologies who are really firmly digital natives. They barely know what prose is when it comes to their work. So how soon will context in a standard need to look a lot more like number 5 versus, say, number 3, where at least it's a clean single shall statement within one phrase or one sentence? Next slide, please. So back to this again, the structure of the standard. We still cleave to the idea that this is important, that the standard is structured well on the back end. My friend from SAE, those folks did a fantastic job a few years ago, updating all their content into a strong XML structure. ASTM with ASME continues to support a common XML language known as NISO STS. And in doing some work with one SDO, it was clear we needed more content at ASTM in that format. This was born in 2011 with ISO, and it's gone wide across ISO, Sensenelac, and North American-based SDOs. So more than ever, we're finding it's a solution, especially as we pilot new ideas and possibilities with SDO partners, test new ways of delivering normative information. So having that structure has been very good. I think we're probably going to hear a little bit about SAE's new product. They've done an amazing job of helping engineers identify the standard sections. And so having that structure again has been very important. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting thing, and it's just sort of a challenge that I'm pointing out that that really all SDOs, DSP included, are tackling, except for maybe floppies, CDs, and DVDs. Most formats of delivering information from the last 30 years are still around. We just keep adding to it. So standards organizations are compelled to meet more and more output types. Next slide, please. So we've got a lot of situations and a lot of folks that we want to support. It's all about how the engineers want to work. Joe talked about the standards community, and the standards community, while it may not be increasing numerically, there is a shift of different folks who have different ways they want to work. So some folks around the globe still want print. So SDOs still offer print. Some still want to be able to print their own and walk around and be able to hold the standard in their hands. So SDOs continue to offer PDFs. Some now prefer to work directly from screens and tablets in a nice single column format. So SDOs work on HTML formats. Now we're in conversations about delivering content in structured formats through APIs like XML and figuring out how components of information will be fed into PLMs and MBSE tools. And here's the thing, we're also in conversations where we're told, do nothing. Industry's already leapt ahead over the last few years, developing their own proprietary systems. They scrape PDFs, pull context they need to content they need to play with their internal data and specifications. And they've got extremely clever folks looking at ways to innovate internally in very fast ways. And it's very interesting. But in different company and industry silos, this could lead to a plethora of conflicting solutions. And if we listen well to Joe this morning, it's clear that to really drive emerging technologies and have consistent and reliable and harnessable data across the chains, working in silos is not, from what we can tell, a 21st century solution, not in the long term. So, do SDOs provide everything new? Nothing new? Will a simple adjustment to our license agreement wrap this up and we all go home? That's the question that I have. Next slide, please. So I brought you a lot of questions today. You were expecting me to talk about actions. So here are some actions from the SDO world as last gathered when we got together, and we have of course, we're adopting enterprise level subscriptions. So there's less, there's only 5 seats who can look at this knowledge today. Sorry, Jane, Bob already got there ahead of you. You'll have to wait to read that information. So enterprise level subscriptions, which allow everybody to get to the information they need, that's useful. Organizations are working with live formulas, so you can interact more directly with the standard. There are standards that are purely XML code that can be converted to runtime activity. We're piloting new software tools to identify parts and requirements, connect data and reference standards so that information on my standard can link with information in an ASME standard and so on. We're working with exploring how to assign IDs to committee identified requirements, provide conduits to the standards committee so that when folks in the industry need to understand the why, they've got a fast track to talk to the committee. Just a quick compliment to the DSP. When I had to do that, I was amazed at how fast I got a response from the DSP committees regarding the whys around some of the mil specs. Very impressive. Deploy ICS codes to better identify relative content. And its close cousin, explore smarter search engines and AI to better tie people to the information and standards that are available. Serving new technologies with more data-focused standards, for example, 3D models tied to PDFs. Building support certifications and related products that industry need to be more efficient as they explore those new technologies that Joe talked about earlier. Provide related information such as linked references and regulation data. ASTM's doing some more ambiguity assessment, and we are adding a requirements management tool to our Compass platform. But we don't think we've solved everything yet. So just so you know, there is activity going on, and we very much hope you'll help us as we resume these conversations. Next slide, please. So George and I had, I've been happily known George Gulla for quite a few years, Joe as well. And we had a few conversations prior to meeting with you today. And George encouraged me to make sure I made you aware of this. The more input SDOs receive, the better we can respond. So we are working to reassemble what we call the North American Smart Standards Discussion Group. And we had taken a bit of a pause working on some other organization sessions, which I'll talk about in a second. Right now, we've got 10 SDOs lined up from Canada and the United States. Our next meeting we're scheduling for later in August of this month. And our communication goals are to discuss much of what I've shared with you today and work on collectively having communication with industry, with the constituents, with the drafters and the committees, and also the users within the different verticals within industry. A few other things going on to keep an eye on. The INCOSI meeting schedule for systems engineers, that's been published for 2023. There's a lot of good conversations going on there. The Standards Technology Forum will be taking place a little later in the fall. The IHS SPAB meeting will be taking place in February. So there's a lot of other opportunities for us to share what we're doing. I think the big challenge right now is to get more with the constituents, though, and the users. So we aren't planning in a vacuum. Please feel free to contact George or me if you'd be open to joining this conversation and sitting with some of these groups and discussions to help us improve our direction. Next slide, please. And so that about wraps it up for me from ASTM. Thank you, Tasha, and thank you, Michael, for having me today. Jesse Chambers will be seeing you at the next Smart Standards meeting. Thank you so much, everybody. If you have any questions, I'll hang around for a sec.
Thanks, Lesley. I think what we'll do is we'll hold questions until the end of the final briefing. So our final speaker for the panel this morning is Mr. Jonathan Archer from SAE International. Jonathan joined SAE in September of 2021 to lead the aerospace standards business development team in developing and executing strategy and facilitating committees to advance new technologies and innovation solutions to address aerospace mobility challenges through consensus standards with specific emphasis on advanced air mobility and unmanned aircraft systems. Prior to joining SAE, Mr. Archer was the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, was with the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, GAMA, as Director of Airworthiness and Certification, and with an international focus on avionics systems, rotorcraft, and safety management systems. Here to discuss what SAE currently has underway in terms of aerospace standards work, what SAE is doing in leveraging digital standards and assisting in workforce development, please welcome Mr. Jonathan Archer.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all. It's an interesting paradigm trying to disseminate and distinguish how we develop digital standards that reflect the digital age and the types of committees that contribute to driving the way standards are produced. So I try to blend the discussion this morning to basically highlight those committees and those organizations that we're working with from industry that drive the digital transformation and how that influences the production of digital ready standards. They may seem disconnected, but actually trying to transfer that content into a digital ready format is challenging when you talk from a material specification to a complex safety and risk-based process. They're very different. They generate different challenges, and therefore the solutions are not always a one-fits-all. So next slide, please. I'll quickly go through who we are. Who is SAE International? Look at some of the new technology areas that we're looking to progress over the next couple of years. What are digital standards? How do we leverage them? How do we produce material that can be consumed by the user? These are not just published and put on a shelf. These are actually actively consumed. How do we do it efficiently, effectively, and ensure that we provide a life cycle for people to use them through? And then obviously workforce development. We can't work in isolation. We have to develop material training for the future and for people to engage. If people aren't aware how to use standards and what they are, then to some extent we failed. So we need to provide a broader ecosystem to get people to understand the technology, how to use standards, and what they're best and used for. Next. So, like most SDOs, we're a neutral forum. We provide an environment for people to come and gain consensus on challenging issues. And the outcome is a standard, which is quite different from we write standards. We're actually developing solutions. That's what standards provide. And with new technology, we're trying to look forward. And within SAE, we've created sort of 10 technology areas. And although they're identified as individual entities, they're actually all cross-connected. And most of those have a digital backbone in some shape or form. So it's producing data. So therefore, that's part of the challenge, is how we convert that data into a digital ready standard so that people can use it in a practical way. So electrification, that's going to include connectivity. It's going to include some aspects of blockchain data. It could include some levels of automation, and it's going to guarantee to include some form of cybersecurity. With advanced manufacturing, you're using advanced materials. Most of those are going towards advanced airframes, which have automation, which require some form of cybersecurity and connectivity. So with those advances in those things, you actually need advanced computing systems. So it's an interconnected future. It's not, you can't just break them out into individual areas because we end up stumbling across each of the others. So that's where we're trying to break these out into a way that we can work with industry, for industry to be able to come together and provide solutions. Next. So what does it mean? We're an SDO. So what? Well, Lesley made the comment of the change in because of COVID. from a numbers perspective, we generally have probably 125, 130 in-person meetings a year. Well, over the last couple of years, that's dropped to, in some instances, just a handful. But a virtual content or hybrid content has gone up into 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 meetings a year. So the way we work, how we work across 59 countries, on average, there's 11,000 participants a year in our standards program. That's a significant thing to manage, and therefore there needs to be tools and an environment where people can come together and do that efficiently, effectively, to produce material that answers the question, not just write a standard. That is not the outcome we're looking for. So currently, we've got nearly 8,000 active documents, using 180 plus technical committees. So we need the tools, we provide the tools, and they're often in a digital format. Next slide. So nothing stands still. Last year, we introduced 3 key groups relating to high energy, voltage, aging, and more key, modeling, simulation, and training. Again, we're looking at the future. It isn't using traditional approaches, it's using more automated solutions, it's questioning the role of a traditional pilot. Is he an operator? What is he doing? Because we're now changing that environment, we need to obviously reflect that in different approaches to training, using more simulation, using more AI and virtual environments. Well, that leads you to do modeling, because those things you don't just create overnight. So again, working back down the chain, using more digital products, using more digital environments, model-based engineering. So all of these things have to work together. Nothing's done in a silo, and it all effectively has to work harmoniously together to make the standards meaningful. Next slide. So doing that is a challenge. And as you probably all know, if you've taken part in any standards activity, it requires a broad ecosystem of players to do that. Whether it's government, whether it's researchers, whether it's a university, whether it's industry, whether it's a prime contractor or supply chain, everybody has a perspective, but you also need leadership. You need people to come together to want to provide a solution that we can all agree to, that isn't tainted by one group or another because it best serves their company's agenda. Doing that is challenging. But because we have good leadership and because people are focused on achieving consensus, we excel. Not just SAE, but any of the SDOs that are working in a consensus environment. Next slide. So one of the relationships that SAE has had has been with DoD. It has been strongly and actively engaged since 1997 with the transfer of 1,500 mil specs. A challenge both for the DoD and for SAE. But working those relationships, working those issues, working to develop standards that address the core problem, we work together better, more efficiently and effectively, and do things in a timely way. And those standards are still enduring. It isn't a one and done. They continue to mature, they continue to address the concerns, and they continue to be current. Next. This is just some of the organizations that we work with, have partnerships with, both from US and European government, but also with industry. It isn't done in a vacuum. It doesn't done in isolation. It's partners through across Europe and North America. And to do that, we produce better standards. Next. So where are we going? What are the new committees and therefore standards that we're producing. Next. System safety, that underpins everything the aerospace community does. Fundamentally answering the mail on how we do safety assurance, how we ensure that a design is reflective of safety and human factors needs. That's embraced through ARP 4754B and ARP 4761A. They're formative standards. They require deeper industry cooperation, governmental cooperation to reflect the new technologies that we're now introducing. As it says, we've just stood up a new committee that now considers human factors as part of that design process, reflective of congressional mandate to the FAA, and the FAA flowed the request to us. It's formative, it's change, but it's reflective in the fact of what are the user's needs. Next. Autonomy. That's an ongoing word on everybody's lips, whether it's AI, whether it's automation, whether it's full autonomy, whatever the catchphrases are, we recognize that this is a leading activity, and G34 works with Eurocase Working Group 114 to collaborate to produce a series of standards. The taxonomy document, AIR 6987, has just recently been produced, providing a baseline for building upon how we use and consider the language of AI. Not just the fact of a practical implementation, but how do we certify it? How do we use it as part of predictive maintenance systems? It's not just a technology that we conceive that we want to use. It's got to be practically implemented. And if it's going to be on an airplane, then it needs to be considered as part of a certification program. Next. Another topic that you can't escape from is sustainability. And it's not just the fact of, oh, let's make everything green. It's what are the practical implications of doing that? Whether it's the introduction of hydrogen. What does hydrogen mean? Well, it's an alternate fuel. Well, that comes together with a whole series of new challenges of, well, how do we handle it? How do we store it in a gaseous or a liquid format? Is that cryogenically cooled? How's it pressurized? And that's part of the way this part of the program has been pulling together to frame those questions and bring the experts to whether that's a refiner, a distributor, a ground handling service, or an airline. They are all part of that value chain that need to support those discussions. The other part of that is materials and intensive processes with additive. Again, you can't just say we've got lots of exotic materials, we're going to do loads of 3D printing. There's an environment to that. There's a context. And that has to be framed in a way that supports the sustainability of the environment we're trying to protect, but also deliver higher volume production, which we've never done before. If we think 40 or 50 aircraft a month is high rate production, then we just need to look at the car industry. The car industry is the model that a lot of large drone and AAM manufacturers are looking to produce the market need that they're forecasting. So how do we do that? So next. And because we're looking at the environment, we're also looking at electrified propulsion. And again, it's not just about putting a battery on an airplane. You know, what are the power requirements? What are their infrastructure needs? How do we fit this together in a broader coalition rather than just looking technologies in isolation? So there are groups looking at how we fit those things together. How we, not just what can SAE do for you, but what is the broader community doing for each other? Using the ANSI roadmaps, using work we've done with Eurocase, with RTCA, with ASTM, putting the broader picture together to understand where the gaps are and how and where it's appropriate to fill those. Next. talked about AM. Everybody talks about AM. Again, we're all doing different parts to the problem. We've certainly specialized in the materials process and qualification activities. There's 38 new specs, looking at a whole variety of metallics, non-metallics, composite materials, and also their qualification using QPLs. Again, that's another ecosystem that requires an awful lot of management, an awful lot of agreement, but when it's put in place and when it's working well, it's a very efficient approach to providing better quality assurance. Next. I talked about it a little earlier. Cybersecurity is become present in the whole of our lives. Not just the fact of, oh, it's another software tool that we apply to protect against threats or intrusion or provide mitigations for a risk or a vulnerability. We're actually looking at it as applied to components, looking at counterfeit components, stopping bad actors bringing great products or copies into the marketplace that don't have the requisite compliance with standards, haven't passed a QPL program. So it's not just the single thread, it's providing coverage across all of the links of the chain. Next. And again, I alluded to this at the beginning, it's the digital transformation isn't just about, well, what is a digital product? It's actually about the data that we produce as part of the certification, continued airworthiness, use of a product, whether it's flying or a ground system that produces information that is useful to the community. How do we do that considering cybersecurity, but also make it available to all the users and actors needing that information? And we're looking at using blockchain for aspects of that. But the extension of that is, well, what is the digital thread? You know, what is the history of a product from materials through use, through it being recycled? And obviously, what's the role of model-based engineering in that? Not just in the design, but how does that play in the manufacturing space as well? One that I don't think we've really deep dived into. We've talked about it and we haven't explored that. And that's something else that needs to be considered if we're going to leverage high volume production. Next. So next. So what does that mean? Lesley suggested that I include these next few slides after a briefing was done by a colleague of mine, Lesley McKay, about the broader use of digital standards. But fundamentally, the concept and the idea was moving from a paper-based to a clean space, to being fully digital and accessible through a laptop or a PC. You know, a system that you can query, you can pull data, you can audit, you can see change management, a knowledge of truth. Well, we've still continued to work those systems, we get closer, and from a standards perspective, at the moment, that basically means a PDF. So next. But PDFs don't work with PLM or requirements capture systems. You know, as Lesley suggested, you know, how do you reference material? Do you attach a copy? Do you just put the document and the page and the paragraph? You know, what's the detail? What's the consistency? You know, how do you work with these systems in an effective way that if the data changes, it flags in the system, it advises that there's change and that change needs to be evaluated. It's not just a case of, oh, there's a change. Well, that's great. You look at the data, that looks fine. You know, are there broader implications of change to the system? Next. And it's not just our standards either. You know, aircraft vehicles are not certified just by one SDO standards. It requires many. And so part of the tools that we've been looking at to help with that digitization is, can we consume not just our own standards, but everybody else's? Whether we do it as a service or whether it's done through a third party, through a license, that's up for question. But fundamentally, a product, a design has requirements. You satisfy those requirements by identifying an acceptable means of compliance. A standard might be that, but it also might be a government reference document as well. So the same rules apply. It doesn't matter what the source is, it still has to be under control. It still has to be modeled. It still has to be representative and validated through traditional process. Whether it's modeling and simulation, whether it's a physical test, that data has to be fed back into the system and validated against what the standard says. Because in some instances, the standard is the test method. It provides levels of acceptable data to ensure that the product or the part actually is compliant, not just the fact if you use the right design criteria. Next. So I mentioned it that it's not just got to be one thread. It's got to be externally interoperable with many different PLM or tool systems. And that's part of the interaction from an ANSI perspective with smart standards, but also looking at, as Lesley said, context. Data is just a data point. Data becomes useful information when it has context. And that's part of the challenge that we're facing in using the appropriate technologies to ensure that context is retained. Next. But also putting it into formats that it can be consumed both digitally through a library, but also then pulled into digital tools with the requisite tolerances or diffs, but with the context that if it goes to procurement, that they're translated appropriately. It's no good just having a design that when you go and procure, you can't procure the right part because it doesn't translate into actually what's on the shelf. Next. So looking at it from a productivity perspective, what are the hours saved? Well, the team has been looking at if you can eliminate the cutting and pasting of a PDF, you could save 10 hours. Well, that's pretty good. If all the relevant standards are in one place as a digital library, that could save you 2 hours. So as we break this down and look at it from different perspective of reducing errors, reducing time taken to do something, maximizing the audit trail through digital thread, time's money. That's impressive because we don't just do things once, we do things many times. And if you're using standard modules, that's also a time saver. So it's something that builds. Next. Okay. From a marketing perspective, we've got our marketplace is Mobilus, which provides everything in a PDF format, which great. OnQ basically turns those PDF into digital data. It can be built into libraries. It can be built into libraries that you basically query. So what's the standard for this particular material? Or what are the requirements to comply with a certain regulation? But it can also be turned into a database library for use and consumption within digital tools, PLM, model-based environments. So we're looking at both because, as Lesley said, not everybody wants change. Not everybody wants to be able to consume this data in a digital thread format. People still want a PDF, want to print it out, want to mark it up, want to staple it to a part sheet or a rec. So we've got to provide all of those things from a legacy perspective, but how do we leverage that moving forward? Recognizing that there's an investment and ultimately provide the flexibility so we don't constrain the end user. and don't have to tailor it so much that an end user can't consume that data if they do use an electronic environment tool, PLM, whatever. Next. So the flip side of what SAE does, we're not just an SDO. We don't just publish books, journals, standards, research. We also feed back and give back to the community, working with different aspects of K through 12, early collegiate programs, pre-professional development, and collegiate programs. But we also do professional development as well. Not always just using our standards, but building a broader program to try and stimulate people's interest in STEM activities, to raise the profile of what we do as a standards producing community. If we stand still, we wither and die. So we've got to continuously look at the future and contribute to our own success by engagement, by building partnerships, and questioning, are we doing it right? Are we giving the value we think we are with the services we provide? Next. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. Do we have any questions either online or in the audience? No?
I have a question here.
Okay.
So one of the things in the previous presentation that was pointed out was the partial use of standards. And in many cases, a standard becomes complex and assumes that it is integrated completely. When standards are put together, especially in the new digital environment that you're describing, how do you envision the alignment of multiple standards when a program is pulling together parts of these standards in that new digital space? Specifically, how do you achieve conformance when you pull together parts of multiple standards?
I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. I think for parts, components, and processes, that's fairly straightforward because they're designed, the way that they're used is as piece parts. I think the challenge it becomes when you have complex processes. If you're doing a safety analysis to address 251309 or something similar, it's a tailored process. And that's where I think the broader design and certification approach then comes into play. You know, how have you stipulated you're going to do something? Whether that's done through a plan, whether that's done through a certification basis, there are conditioning requirements that shape how you use a standard. You know, certainly in 1309, it gives you the outline requirements of the output expectations. When you look at ARP 4754, it says this standard is tailored to the system it's being applied to. So that's the sort of the conditioning requirement, is that you actually read the introduction, use the review the framing when you apply it, and therefore as the standards applied and you do your verification, that's got to be something that has to come into play. I don't think you can just say I did this or I didn't do that. If we go back to any federal legislation, everybody just looks at the requirements. Well, did you actually read the pretext? Did you actually read the framing? Because if you did, then that provides all the context you need to apply those requirements or the test case or whatever it is that's being framed. So with everything, I think it said, a number of people said it's all about the context. And if we don't apply and capture the context correctly, then whenever the standards is going to be less optimal than it perhaps could be if that context was better exposed.
I believe we had one question in the back.
Yes, good morning. Rich Forselius, Lockheed Martin. And speaking on behalf of the aerospace industry here, you know, we're primes, we're subs, we're partners to DoD and others. And in this context, we're the customer. We're the customer of the standards being developed. We're the customer of the mill standards and mill specs. We're the customer, and we're also providing the technical input to the creation of all of the standards we're discussing. And the key thing here for all of us is efficiency gain. Absolutely everything else is secondary. Therefore, we all have to be 100% dedicated toward the development of digital standards, smart standards, machine readable standards, however they're referred to. Moving forward, this is inevitable. The question is, how quickly are we going to adopt? How quickly are the SDOs going to come to agreements? And that's what I'm worried about here. We need to adopt standards directly into our digital designs. We can't have tabular lookups. We need to take all the attributes directly into the designs. We also need to provide upfront our best technical experts to the relevant technical committees so that the documents created are truly relevant and of current technology. And we are remiss in industry in some ways there. We're not providing enough of our experts. We're not seeing the value of the time and travel, et cetera. However, we have to profess the gains down the road, as you stated here, Jonathan, relative to the hours in that slide of efficiency gains and what have you. We've got to make that case stronger. And honestly, down the road, we don't need our engineers reviewing the standards in detail, especially as PDF documents. That's where we're assured that we've had the right technical experts doing the work up front that we can adopt. But one of our issues is embedded requirements, references to other documents, and we talked about ASTM, SAE, et cetera, the connections and the interconnections. And I'm a little worried there about some of the intellectual property rights. You talked about licensing a little bit there, Jonathan. And this is for you and for Lesley also. Can we quickly overcome some of those legal issues so that we can get to the second and third tier embedded references, if you will, and be able to draw in those requirements as well, and also be aware of all of the configuration management, you know, when reference documents are changed, how does that affect the first tier document, et cetera. But I am worried about intellectual property rights and copyrights in the context of all of this. Can you help me with that?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, IP and copyright are foremost in our minds all the time. And when we use cross-references, we do it in a way that's accepted by the other SDOs. There's generally an accepted approach to how we cross-reference each other's documents and therefore preserving each other's IP. As we move forward in a digital domain, that's another question that we're going to have to step forward of, if you know, not everybody's standards are uploaded into a library or referenced through a library, then it ends with a reference. We can't go further than that because that infringes on somebody's IP. So the same rules that we have now in place would carry forward if there wasn't a license to access that other data. And that's where we have to come together as a community and understand how these digital libraries are created. And to be honest, this is a question for industry as well. How do you want to consume standards? Where do you want to buy them? You know, how do we resell them? And therefore, how do we build, or how do the tool manufacturers build databases that access the relevant information when a user needs it? You know, we provide an environment for industry to come together and collaborate. And if industry wants to solve these questions, then industry has to come forward and we have to work with you to help solve those problems. If people don't want to step forward and provide us with use cases to develop some of these solutions from an SDO perspective, then there's not a lot we can do. But we have been working with industry to try and absorb the internal company standards into OnQ and some of the other tools that are flowing from the back of that. So if Lockheed Martin really has a test case, then please get in touch with me or Lesley McKay, and we'd happily start looking at the practicalities of whether your data will work with the solution we have or what we have to do to tailor it to be more generic.
Yeah, I was just going to add, if I may, from
I wanted to just address Richard's, go ahead, Lesley. Lesley, go ahead.
I think, George, you and I are probably going to say the same thing, but yeah, just to echo what Jonathan said, this is exactly the conversation that I was addressing and George and I talked about before we joined you all this morning, which is understanding what the needs are is going to help us tremendously. We can figure out ways to manage IP. What we don't want to do is figure out 20 ways to manage IP and then find that only 5 of them are actually valid and necessary for use by industry. And there's a lot of things that go into there as far as IP and copyright. It's also then making sure that the committee intent is still inherent in the way that data and content is managed. So that's certainly a concern for us. George, what were you going to say?
We know copyright protection has been a challenge for decades, whether it's in print, PDF, certainly XML. And the discussions that are taking place at ISO and IEC, certainly within the joint business group, is that the large users and companies that rely on standards are not about to infringe on copyright because their lawyers will have a field day. So, you know, those end users that are going to make use of standards in digital form are going to be, you know, the Fortune 500 companies, like those that are very much design and manufacturing intensive. There'll be early adopters, there'll be laggards. There are those that essentially, Lesley said, you know, the world will stand still. But a lot of it has to be pretty much documented and addressed in the licensing agreements that take place between the SDO or the copyright holder and the ultimate end user. And as long as those license agreements basically do a very good job of explaining and documenting and articulating how that company and its subcontractors want to use that information, then I think we can feel a lot better about copyright protection. But we know it's still very much an honor system. And word certainly gets around within industry as to who may be violating copyright. I'm worried about intellectual property and piracy by those entities that are very active in doing commercial piracy today. And I think that's where the government needs to step in and be more assertive in protecting the copyright. But I believe it's the license agreement that is going to certainly address the copyright issues.
And again, it's not just from a legal perspective. There has to be that dedication to the curation of the information itself. ASTM has some products that have been duplicated and are inferior, and they are impactful to health and safety issues around the world. And we'll go and find them posted on boards. And that's very worrisome too. So making sure that the information, when if it is mishandled, ends up corroding and not having that same quality, that is a really big concern for me as well. So yeah, having a good answer that sure protects the legality of the information, but also the quality and all the things we've talked about today to further the efficiencies and security of the information so that it works and plays well together. that's going to also become more problematic when it goes into the wild and less reputable folks take it and use it in the worst way. So again, I think ASTM's often taken the position that we believe most organizations, as George said, want to do right, and they've got great information managers and corporate librarians who help confirm that. And sometimes it's simply a matter of misunderstanding. Oh, I didn't realize I shouldn't be doing that. Okay. And again, if it ties to efficiency, then we make an easy path to the right way to work with information if we have that path set up well.
This is Michael. I hate to cut off such an important discussion, but we have a very aggressive schedule today. So we'll go ahead and jump into a quick 5-minute break, and I want to kick off the next panel right at 10. Thank you.